If you were running the Helix tools on your own just as a standalone thing to reg your own characters, that's the first setup video is all you need to run through. But in this video, I'm going to go through the tools config file, which has a secondary file that's in your users. You'll find if you run the tools at all, you'll get a v1 folder in your documents with a user settings file. So the tools config file that comes with the toolset doesn't have projects enabled. Right now it's set to false. And project is just a way of telling the tools where a contents directory folder exists. This will allow the tools to do things like find all the rigs in your project and allow you to pick import them or swap characters between, or swap models of characters that share the same rig or same skeleton. And just some general use with the exporter as well. So the first thing you want to do is, if you are setting this up for a larger project, again this is just for studios or a large school project or something like that, we'll change this over to true. And then the project drive is your default drive that your project is going to exist in. The project root path is where your base set of content is going to exist. This would be, for our V1 Studio, this is the top directory that branches off between our source data and our actual in-game Unreal data. And then the content root path is where our source data lives off of this V1 path. And then character folder is just the name of a folder called, or where you would save all your characters. Just kind of informs some of the tools of what folder names to look for when it's searching through your directories, just to make those searches a little faster. So if you have a larger project set up, you'll want to set up a project drive, a project root path, and then a content root path. It is possible that if you wanted to combine this all as one, if you want to say that my project root path is the same as my content root path, you can just not include a content root path and include everything in the project root path. The other thing to look at here is this user settings file. To start out, the user settings file is not going to have really anything in it. This file gets edited, new items get added to it as the user does things that require them to, or that saves their settings that are different than the tool defaults. So this will only ever save those differences. It's not going to save every single possible option in the file all at once. But when we look at, each user looks at both of these files to figure out like where our project exists. So if you like RStudio and you have artists, you have their project installs all on different drives, especially from working from home, different drives, different drive letters, different folder structures, everything. Each individual person can go ahead and copy this project section into their user settings. And then just modify the pieces that are relevant to them. So maybe someone actually uses the D drive and they called their base project projects. And then if you're using a consolidated, like a Perforce source code management or source management, your content root path and your character folder path are probably going to be the same. So now this overrides my local user to look for a D projects path instead of a CV1 path. So if you have a consistent studio setup, you can just leave it in the tools config, and anyone who's using that consistent setup will be able to immediately start using the tools. But if individual users all have their content installed in a separate location or a separate drive or anything like that, they can override those settings here. And any setting that you find in the tools config is actually overrideable in the user settings at any time. And the other thing to look at here is the exporter settings. We have an export pattern, which is from your source working file, so from your Maya animation file, where should I save an FBX file? 2 dots and a slash just means go backwards one folder. 3 dots and a slash followed by a folder name means go backwards as many folders as it takes until I find a folder with this name. So this current pattern is saying go backwards as many folders as it takes until I find working, then go back one more folder. And we have this match directory, which is true or false. If we're at false, then all of your animations would just be saved directly into the same folder that the working folder is in. Match directory actually requires a triple dot working or triple dot match pattern, and it will follow all of the folders that your animation was in. So if your animation is in working, unarmed, and you want your FBX to be exported into, well, let's back up a little bit. So if this is all in like an animations working, and then unarmed folder that you're working out of, match directory will walk back to the working, so it'll walk back one more and will be in the animations directory. And then it will match all the folder paths that were after working that it walked backwards from. In this case, unarmed. So our animation will actually get exported out to animations unarmed, and then the FBX name. Hopefully that is clear. I know that's a little bit of a very programmery convention and thought process on working with this. But essentially, let's just bring up a quick example. So let's say we have so this is our file path. The export pattern that we're looking at right now of go back to working, go back one more, and then match pattern. So this will go back to working, and it will remember these two directories, unarmed combat. Then it'll go back one more directory into animations, and we will have an animation export that lands in here. So we'll now have characters, animations, unarmed combat, walk forward. And if I made match directory is false, all of our animations will just get dumped all the way back at this pattern of one directory above working, which is our animations folder. So all your animations would end up being dumped into the animations folder itself here. Hopefully that makes it a little bit more clear about what match directory is actually doing. And what these little dot notations mean in this pattern matching. Then the file name pattern, the exporter has two parts to it, an asset and a definition. The definition is, the exporter was made to do more than animations. So we don't use the name, animation name, or character name. Now we have to kind of generalize that down to asset name and definition name. So in most cases, the asset is going to be your character, and the definition is going to be the animation name itself. And the file name pattern will just place those wherever you put the brackets asset and brackets, or angled brackets definition, and then whatever else you put around it. So if you don't want the character name first, you can always switch it around. So the character name comes after the definition, or whatever else you want tagged into your file names. Then one last thing is when running your projects, we have all of our projects rigs in a rigging folder. And this is, again, just like that character folder. This informs the tools of what folder it should be looking for, so that when it searches through all of your content to find all of the rigs, it can do it with some kind of direction to make it a lot speedier. You can just ignore anything that's not a rigging folder. If you don't want to call the folder that all your rigs are in rigging, and you can rename it here. And then the rig file pattern, this is, again, it's searching for Maya files that end in _rig. This is any kind of star terminated kind of file pattern. You find this same pattern in pretty much any kind of searching. So like the Maya outliner, when you search, you can do stars as wildcards. It says star on both sides. It says rig, _rig can be anywhere in the name. Anything can come after it, and anything can come before it. Star just before means it ends in _rig. Without an extension, that's actually not going to return you anything, so we'd want to make sure we end in _rig.ma or MB if you're using Maya binary files. I would highly suggest using Maya ASCII files for all of this. The tools, some of the tools that try to figure out what characters all belong together on a single skeleton will read through these Maya files as ASCII files and assume that you're saving them as Maya ASCII. So if you save your rigs as Maya binary files, you will lose some of that functionality. Then in tools, and you can decide whether or not you want to actually remove the Python compiled files every time the tools is run or not. I do this just for cleanliness, so that if someone has recently sank the toolset, that any old tools get essentially, or old files essentially get wiped out, and it forces Python to recompile all of your code when it starts up, which is a really fast process. Then finally, if you don't want to put your stuff in or your compiled files in a folder called bin, this is the folder path that it will look for those tools in based off of the v1 tools root environment variable. So our environment variable is set to C v1 freeform rigs or freeform tools 1.0 beta, and it looks for the DLL files inside of a bin folder in that. If it was bin x64 or debug, something like that, then it would be looking for an x64 folder in here and a debug folder in there, or whatever path you decide you want to use for your tools. Bin is just kind of a pretty standard form. And I guess it's worth mentioning, there's this developer mode. So if anyone in the studio or team is specifically developing this tool set, and I would highly suggest not building your DLLs on top of the code that your team is running. This is just for safety purposes. Like you want to make sure that any errors you introduce don't immediately find their way to the team, so you want to work kind of outside of their environment. And user can go ahead and put this developer section in their user tools. Set it to use developer mode, and then you can define a specific file path, a project drive and tools path for where you're compiling your files to. So you don't need to compile into the freeform tools directory. You can be compiling into some entirely separated code path, and the tools will then use whatever you've entered here for that DLL path. And Perforce has not been tested outside of our work from home settings. Your host will be whatever server host number your studio is using. Same with the server on the sides. So the server should be some numbers characters, colon, numbers characters, colon, and some numbers. Then if you are trying to set up Perforce with that, let me grab the names of these here. So inside your user settings, each individual user will need a Perforce setting. Every one of these categories, if you're editing these by hand, needs to have a comma after them except for the last one. The comma tells it to continue searching through the file. So instead of host, you'd have client host name, username. So your username is going to be your credentials or or whatever your studio has set up your username on Perforce to be. And the client host name is if you have made a fresh workspace, it is the name that follows your username. So say my name is Mzom. My client, or my P4V would look something like, let's take this out. Something like this. In this case, PC name PC would be my client host name. This again depends exactly on how your Perforce and your client have been set up in the studio. I am happy to kind of help debug any issues with that to get that running, since that has not been tested by anyone. Well, other than our people. I believe that's everything for the tools config file.